It was just an ordinary flight, or so they thought. Angela Reed, a successful black entrepreneur, boarded her first-class seat, ready to enjoy a rare moment of peace. But just minutes after takeoff, turbulence wasn't the only thing shaking the cabin. A flight attendant, eyes sharp and voice cold, hovered over Angela's row, accusing her of disturbing the atmosphere by simply existing in the wrong seat. Passengers whispered, the pilot got involved, and Angela found herself humiliated at 30,000 feet. But what happened next no one saw coming. By the time the plane landed, Angela had already made a few phone calls. 7 days later, she wasn't just a passenger, she was the owner of the airline. And the first order of business? Firing the pilot and every crew member who thought prejudice belonged in the sky. Stay with me, because this is more than just a story about power. It's about justice. It's about reclaiming space. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from today? And if you believe in standing up, even at 30,000 feet, hit that subscribe button. This story? It's just getting started. The plane hummed with that peculiar stillness that exists somewhere between motion and silence. As though suspended not just above the clouds but outside the bounds of time itself. Angela Hamilton leaned back into the leather seat, her hands gliding over the cover of her journal, a small luxury she allowed herself on long flights. First class had always been a strange space for her, not because she didn't belong there, but because others seemed determined to remind her that she didn't. It wasn't new. Nothing about the way Lauren Pierce, the flight attendant, watched her was new. The glances, quick but cutting, like invisible paper cuts on the skin. Angela had felt those eyes before in boardrooms, on sidewalks, at charity galas where she stood among people who believed her invitation was a clerical error. Lauren passed Angela's seat without speaking, her smile forced, eyes sliding away the way someone avoids looking directly at the sun. Angela saw it for what it was, a small, careful rejection, the kind that leaves no fingerprints. Angela smiled faintly and opened her journal. She wasn't in the business of chasing ghosts. The turbulence began softly, barely a whisper beneath the steady hum of the engines. She steadied the pen in her hand, pressing it to the paper, hoping to escape into the familiar rhythm of words. But there it was again. Lauren, returning with unnecessary frequency, offering blankets, asking questions that needed no answers. Everything all right, ma'am? Angela looked up slowly, the kind of slow that let the silence stretch just enough to make the other person uncomfortable. I'm fine, Angela said, her voice gentle, though she was not in the habit of offering comfort to strangers who insisted on testing the shape of her presence. The attendant nodded, but Angela saw the flicker of hesitation. There was something else beneath Lauren's professional veneer. Something unspoken and unmistakable, the belief that Angela's seat should belong to someone else. This was the kind of turbulence that had nothing to do with wind or altitude. Angela turned back to her journal, letting the pen flow despite the quiet storm brewing around her. But words have a way of failing you when the weight of the world presses too close. Another ripple of turbulence shook the cabin. Stronger this time. A few passengers glanced up, but none of them looked concerned. Except Lauren. She hovered at the edge of the cabin, her eyes fixed of all places on Angela. Angela felt the weight of that stare like an anchor on her chest. The engines roared steady, but inside the plane, the air tightened, thick with something Angela knew too well. She was familiar with this dance. She had been here before. It starts small, a lingering glance, a shift in tone, a polite but pointed reminder that you are occupying space you weren't expected to inhabit. Lauren's gaze lingered just long enough for Angela to catch it, for their eyes to lock. Angela smiled again, but this time there was no warmth behind it, only the weight of years, of knowing too much, of having to smile when the air around her whispered something else entirely. The turbulence passed, but something else lingered, a tension thick enough to press against her ribcage. Angela returned to her journal, the pen trembling lightly against the page. This was just the beginning. The second wave of turbulence came like a whisper of something inevitable, a shudder through the body of the plane. Soft enough to be ignored, but loud enough to remind you that control was never absolute. Angela Hamilton felt it beneath her fingertips as they rested on the edge of her journal. She had not written much since takeoff. The words that had once come so easily felt heavier now, as though weighed down by the gaze of the flight attendant whose eyes found her seat again and again. It was the smallest of things that betrayed the world's prejudice. Not the loud proclamations or open confrontations, no. Those were too easy to dismiss. It was the glance held just a moment too long. The smile that curved but never reached the eyes. The space that tightened around you without anyone needing to say a word. Angela had learned long ago that there were two kinds of turbulence in life. One you could feel beneath your feet, rattling the plane and making drinks tremble in their glasses. The other was far more dangerous, living in the silence between strangers. She closed the journal, the soft leather cool against her palm. The plane dipped slightly, and a nervous laugh drifted up from a few rows back. But it wasn't the passengers Angela was watching, it was Lauren. The flight attendant stood near the cockpit, whispering to another crew member, her eyes cutting toward Angela's seat with a flicker of unease. Angela knew that look. It was the same look security guards gave her when she lingered too long in department stores. The same glance from hotel clerks who assumed she had taken a wrong turn. It was the expression of a world that saw her presence not as normal, but as a problem waiting to unfold. Lauren approached her row again, gliding down the aisle with practiced grace. "Ma'am." Lauren's voice carried that peculiar softness that cloaks something harder underneath. "The captain asked me to check in. Is everything all right here?" Angela met her eyes, calm but unyielding. "I believe so. Is there a reason it wouldn't be?" Lauren hesitated. For just a moment, there it was, the crack. The hesitation that let the truth seep through. "Some of the passengers." Lauren's eyes flickered toward the rows behind her. "They mentioned that you seemed uneasy. The turbulence, perhaps?" Angela almost smiled. Almost. No more uneasy than anyone else. She replied evenly, though she suspected the answer was not what Lauren had hoped to hear. Lauren stood there for a beat too long, as if waiting for Angela to reveal something that wasn't there. When she finally moved on, Angela could feel the eyes of the other passengers sliding toward her like shadows crawling along the cabin walls. It was remarkable how quickly things could shift, how easily a sense of belonging could dissolve into suspicion. A full minute passed before Angela let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But the quiet was short-lived. The cockpit door opened slightly, just enough for the captain to lean out. His eyes scanned the rows of first-class passengers, and when they landed on Angela, something subtle but unmistakable hardened in his face. Angela held his gaze. He disappeared back into the cockpit. But the air did not soften. When the turbulence returned, it felt heavier. Angela felt it in her chest, the slow build of something that could not be swallowed down or ignored. Minutes later, the captain emerged fully from the cockpit, his strides long and deliberate as he approached her seat. "You," he said, his voice loud enough to slice through the hum of the engines. "I need to speak with you." Angela blinked, momentarily caught between disbelief and recognition. "Excuse me? You've been causing disruptions," the captain continued, his words heavy with authority that had no place here. "Your behavior is making the other passengers uncomfortable." Angela's breath stilled. There it was, the accusation, hanging in the air like smoke, suffocating and impossible to ignore. The cabin fell silent, save for the quiet rustling of passengers pretending not to eavesdrop. Angela sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her lap as if they had nowhere else to be. "I haven't done anything," she said, her voice deliberate, calm, steady. The captain's expression did not change. "That's not what I've heard." Angela scanned the faces around her, searching for an ally, but none of them held her gaze. Not the man in the navy suit 3 rows ahead who had nodded politely during boarding. Not the woman reading a glossy magazine, who now held it just high enough to avoid looking at her directly. She was alone, but not unfamiliar with the feeling. Angela shifted slightly in her seat, squaring her shoulders. "I'm not moving," she said, her voice louder now. "I paid for this seat just like everyone else." The captain's jaw tightened, but Angela could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She recognized it, the fear that comes when someone refuses to fold neatly into the box you have built for them. "If you can't comply," he said slowly, "I'll have security waiting when we land." Angela felt the weight of every eye in that cabin pressing against her like an unspoken verdict. "Do what you need to do," she replied, her voice unwavering. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her retreat. The captain hesitated for just a breath longer, then turned sharply, disappearing back into the cockpit. Lauren lingered near the front of the cabin, a small smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth before she, too, vanished behind the curtain. Angela stared ahead, out the window, where the clouds stretched endlessly beyond the glass. She had weathered storms before. But even as the sky lay still, Angela knew the real turbulence had only just begun. The sky outside the window was a canvas of soft blues and fleeting clouds. But Angela Hamilton saw none of it. Her reflection stared back at her, calm and composed, but she knew what lay beneath it, the tightening knot just below her ribs. The heat simmering quietly behind her eyes. The cabin had settled into an uneasy hush. Passengers returned to their magazines and in-flight movies. But the air had shifted, charged with something unspoken. Angela felt it in the glances that flickered toward her row, in the half-second hesitations before conversations resumed. She was no stranger to this kind of quiet. It was the same quiet that fell when she entered a luxury boutique alone. The same quiet that followed her when she stepped into boardrooms filled with men who mistook her for someone's assistant. A quiet that spoke louder than words. Angela reached for her water glass, but her hand hovered over it, fingers trembling with a restlessness she couldn't quite contain. She drew her hand back slowly, folding it into her lap instead. It wasn't the captain's words that lingered, but the ease with which they had been accepted. All it took was a suggestion, one stray thread tugged at the edges of perception, and suddenly the fabric unraveled. She could feel the story writing itself in the minds of the other passengers. A woman, upset by turbulence. A woman, making others uncomfortable. They would not remember her silence. They would not recall the journal that lay untouched beside her. No, they would remember the outline of the captain's finger pointing her way. Angela exhaled slowly, sinking deeper into her seat, as if doing so would anchor her against the weight of it all. The flight attendant appeared again, the sharp click of her heels against the floor drawing closer with each step. Lauren Pierce's smile was smaller now, but no less practiced. She stopped just short of Angela's row, turning instead to the man seated across the aisle. "Would you care for something to drink, sir?" Angela glanced sideways. The man was white, middle-aged, dressed in casual elegance, the kind of man who blended seamlessly into spaces like this. He barely glanced up from his tablet as he accepted the glass Lauren handed him. Angela waited, but Lauren never turned to her. The cart rolled past, leaving Angela's tray table empty, save for the untouched water glass from earlier. A small omission, hardly noticeable, but Angela felt it. She let it pass without a word. She had long since learned that battles did not always announce themselves with raised voices or clenched fists. Sometimes, they arrived like this, in the smallest of slights, carefully measured and designed to be deniable. Angela shifted her gaze back to the clouds. And then, as if summoned by the weight of her thoughts, Lauren appeared again, this time stopping at Angela's row. "Ma'am," Lauren said, the smile now entirely gone. "The captain asked me to confirm if you'll be moving to another seat. We can arrange for one in the rear cabin." Angela looked up slowly, her eyes meeting Lauren's without flinching. "Did the captain say why I needed to move?" Angela's voice was steady, deliberate. Lauren hesitated. "There have been concerns." "Concerns?" Angela repeated, tasting the word as if it were something bitter. The word was empty, yet it carried the weight of judgment. A word that said everything without saying anything at all. Angela leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. "No, I won't be moving." Lauren's lips tightened into a thin line. And for a brief moment, something flickered in her eyes, something Angela had seen before. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. Lauren retreated without another word. But Angela could feel her frustration lingering, trailing behind like the faintest scent of smoke after a fire has been extinguished. The turbulence returned, more insistent this time. Angela closed her eyes, listening to the soft clinking of glasses as the plane shook. She told herself that this was temporary, that the seatbelt light would flicker off, and the sky would smooth itself out again. But when she opened her eyes, she saw the captain once more, standing at the front of the cabin, his gaze fixed directly on her. Angela met his stare and did not look away. It was not defiance. It was simply endurance. The plane dipped slightly, and with it came a soft murmur of unease from the other passengers. Angela felt their eyes on her again, searching for signs of fault, proof that the captain's concern was justified. And wasn't that the way of things? To wait for the moment when the mask of composure slipped, even for an instant, to seize upon that moment and build entire narratives around it. Angela pressed her palms against the armrests, grounding herself in the silence. She had not asked to become a symbol, but she knew how quickly silence could become consent. And so she sat still, unwavering as the captain returned to the cockpit and the plane settled back into the uneasy rhythm of flight. The storm had not yet passed, but Angela would not yield to it. Not now. Not ever. The plane pressed forward through the sky, steady but relentless. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, as if the weight of unspoken things had somehow thickened it. Angela Hamilton shifted in her seat, though she was careful not to betray the discomfort curling in her chest. It was remarkable, she thought, how people could sit so close and remain so distant. Across the aisle, the man with the tablet stole a glance in her direction, but when Angela's eyes met his, he quickly returned to his screen. Further down, a woman laughed softly at something on her phone, unaware or perhaps woefully unaware of the tension that sat like a bruise against the fabric of first class. Angela had learned long ago that silence was rarely empty. Silence carried weight. It bore the fingerprints of history, of things swept under rugs and tucked away behind polite smiles. And today, that silence had a shape. She felt it in the gap between the flight attendant's footsteps as she passed. She saw it in the way passengers shifted, subtly, leaning just far enough away to create distance without moving at all. She knew this performance well. It was the same choreography performed at every crosswalk where drivers locked their doors at the sight of her. The same retreating steps in elevators when the doors slid open, revealing her standing alone, but there was something crueler about it here. In the compressed stillness of the sky, where no exit existed and no amount of wealth or success could lift her above it. Angela reached for her journal, her fingers brushing the smooth leather cover. But she let her hand fall away. Some storms could not be put into words. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be descending shortly. We appreciate your patience and cooperation." Angela exhaled quietly, but her body remained stiff, coiled with the anticipation of landing. She knew that whatever awaited her on the ground would not be as simple as stepping off this plane. Moments later, Lauren reappeared, standing just a few feet away. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of a seat, but her gaze lingered on Angela longer than necessary. There was something in Lauren's eyes, something that almost resembled satisfaction. Angela met her gaze with the same calm she had carried throughout the flight. But even calm had limits. "Is there something I can help you with?" Angela asked, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the hum of the engines. Lauren's eyes narrowed, but her smile remained intact. "We'll have security meet you at the gate," she said quietly, as if delivering the news were some form of kindness. Angela felt the words like a fist to her ribs. "Security?" Lauren gave a slight shrug, feigning sympathy. "It's standard when there are concerns." Concerns. That word again. Angela had spent a lifetime navigating the meaning behind such words. She could see the threads of it weaving together. The captain's lingering gaze. The whispers from the other passengers. The absence of protest. It wasn't the accusation that hurt, it was how quickly everyone else accepted it. Angela's fingers curled around the armrest, but she forced herself to relax. She would not let them see her rattle. The plane began its descent, the shift in altitude making ears pop and shoulders tense. Angela watched as Lauren turned away, walking briskly toward the front of the cabin. There was no sense in fighting shadows. And yet, something inside Angela rebelled against the idea of walking off that plane quietly, under the watchful eyes of strangers who had already made up their minds about who she was. She had spent years refusing to shrink herself to make others comfortable. She would not start now. The wheels touched down with a jolt, pulling her from her thoughts. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Angela could feel the anticipation building the way passengers stirred in their seats, gathering their belongings with a kind of restless urgency. Angela remained seated. She would be the last to leave. Not because she had to be, but because she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her rush. The cabin door opened with a soft hiss, and Angela watched as passengers filtered out, one by one, their eyes flickering toward her but never lingering long enough to meet her gaze. It was easier that way. When the last of them disappeared, Angela stood, collecting her bag and sliding her journal inside with careful precision. As she stepped into the aisle, Lauren and the captain stood by the exit, their postures rigid, rehearsed. Angela met the captain's gaze without hesitation. "You'll be hearing from me," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. The captain didn't reply. He simply nodded, as if the conversation were already over. But Angela knew better. This was far from over. The airport terminal buzzed with life as Angela stepped into the cool air of the jet bridge, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Just ahead, 2 uniformed security officers stood waiting. Angela's eyes drifted past them, toward the distant hum of travelers, the carousel of faces that blurred together in a sea of motion. She had faced worse than this. And she would face this too. As she walked toward them, she carried with her the weight of every glance, every whispered word, and every quiet act of dismissal that had tried, time and time again, to make her small. But Angela Hamilton had never been small. And she would not start now. The gate was too bright. 2 sterile white lights humming overhead like interrogators, exposing every flaw, every imperfection. Angela Hamilton stood at the end of the jet bridge, her fingers tightening around the handle of her leather bag. The security officers ahead were waiting. But they weren't in a hurry. No, they stood easy, relaxed in the knowledge that the world bent toward them. Angela had no such luxury. She could feel the weight of the captain's gaze still lingering behind her. Though he had long since disappeared back into the cockpit, she could feel Lauren's satisfaction curling like smoke in the stale airport air. Angela stepped forward. The officers, one tall and thin, the other stockier, arms crossed over his chest, watched her approach with the quiet scrutiny that often disguised itself as professionalism. They weren't aggressive. They didn't need to be. She slowed as she neared them, waiting for one of them to speak. It was the stocky one who broke the silence first. His voice was calm, polite even, but there was something beneath it, something cold and distant. "Miss Hamilton, is that correct?" Angela nodded, her expression unreadable. "Would you mind coming with us for a moment?" There it was, that same soft tone Lauren had used, the kind meant to appear harmless, as if the words were being offered with an open palm rather than a fist. But Angela had learned long ago that a soft voice could build the walls of a cell just as easily as a raised one. She didn't move. "Is there a reason?" Angela asked, her voice cutting through the hum of airport chatter behind them. The officer's eyes flickered to his partner, as if searching for the answer in the air between them. "We've been asked to speak with you regarding a disturbance on board." Angela's lips pressed together, and she allowed herself a single, measured breath. "What disturbance?" she asked, tilting her head just slightly. The officer hesitated, his confidence faltering under her gaze. "I'm not sure, ma'am. We're just following protocol." Angela almost laughed. Protocol. That word again. It had followed her through stores, down streets, into lobbies of hotels where the front desk attendants assumed she had taken a wrong turn. Protocol had become the armor that shielded cowardice. She held the officer's gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, taut as a wire. "If there's been a misunderstanding, I'd like to clear it up now," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I won't be following you anywhere unless you tell me exactly why I'm being asked to." The officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and Angela watched him closely, noting the way his shoulders stiffened, subtle but familiar. It was the discomfort of a man unused to being questioned by someone who did not fear him. "Ma'am, it's a simple request." Angela's eyes narrowed. "Then it shouldn't be hard to answer." The second officer, the taller one, finally spoke. His voice was lower, rougher around the edges. "Look, we don't want to make this a bigger issue than it needs to be." Angela's eyes flickered between them. She could feel the attention of passers-by beginning to gather. The wait travelers slowed as they approached the gate, pretending not to watch but unable to look away. She had lived long enough to recognize that this moment was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the eyes around her. It belonged to the quiet judgments being made in real time, to the stories already forming in the minds of people who had not seen what happened on the plane, but who would decide for themselves the shape of the truth. Angela inhaled deeply, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat in her chest. She had no choice but to stand taller. "You can make this as big or as small as you want," she said, her voice unwavering. "But I'm not going anywhere until you give me a reason." The taller officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if this were all some great inconvenience. Angela had seen that sigh before. It was the sigh of teachers who called her too assertive. The sigh of bosses who mistook her ambition for arrogance. The sigh of people who wanted her to stop speaking because they had already decided they would not listen. The officer leaned in, lowering his voice. Look, if you cooperate, we can wrap this up quickly. No need to make this harder than it needs to be. Angela's gaze didn't waver. There's nothing hard about asking for respect. The officer stepped back, shaking his head slightly, but Angela saw the hesitation. The second-guessing creeping in around the edges. For a long, uncomfortable moment, none of them spoke, and then, from behind her, a voice cut through the quiet. Excuse me, what exactly is the problem here? Angela turned, surprised to find the man from across the aisle, tablet in hand. Eyes narrowed, standing just a few feet away. The officers looked at him, their expressions momentarily unreadable. It's just a misunderstanding, the stocky officer replied, but the man didn't move. I was on that flight, he said plainly. There was no disturbance. Angela glanced at him, recognizing the shift in the air almost immediately. It was the shift that often happened when someone who looked the part, someone who fit the mold, decided to stand just close enough for their privilege to cast a shadow. Angela wasn't sure if she should be grateful or irritated by it. But she understood its value. The taller officer exchanged a glance with his partner. Well, if that's the case, the officer said, clearing his throat, then I suppose we're finished here. Angela said nothing. She simply watched as the officers stepped aside. Their shoulders squared but their steps lighter, as though relieved to escape the weight of their own actions. Angela nodded politely to the man who had spoken up, though she made no effort to linger. She had no desire to thank him for intervening in something that should not have required intervention at all. As she walked toward the terminal, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, Angela felt the familiar hum of anger beneath her skin. But anger, she knew, could be sharpened into something else. This wasn't the end. No, this was simply another chapter. Airports are peculiar places. They hold you in their belly, letting time stretch thin, making strangers out of those you thought you knew, and witnesses out of those who would rather look away. Angela Hamilton sat in the corner of the airport lounge, her back straight, her fingers tracing the rim of a coffee cup gone cold. The world outside the glass was in motion. Planes taxied. Baggage carts rattled by. People hurried to gates, but inside, she felt suspended, as if time had stalled the moment she walked away from those officers. She had been here before. Not in this exact room, but in the company of this same silence. A silence thick with the memory of steps she wasn't allowed to take. Doors that had once been closed to her, and the persistent whisper of doubt that followed her even now, when her name carried weight in rooms she once feared to enter. Across the lounge, the man with the tablet sat down, one row away but close enough to remind her of his presence. He hadn't spoken to her since intervening, and Angela preferred it that way. She owed him nothing, not thanks, not conversation, not even a glance of acknowledgement. There is a certain loneliness in being defended by someone who does not share your burden. She shifted her focus back to the window, the clouds heavy against the horizon, reflecting her own unspoken unrest. A soft chime broke through the lounge, announcing delayed flights and gate changes. People sighed, grumbled, gathered their things, but Angela remained still. She wasn't in a hurry. The meeting waiting for her on the other side of the country would happen. With or without this flight. The deals, the handshakes, the polished conversations, it all seemed distant now. What mattered most wasn't the meeting. It was the story that had been unfolding since she stepped onto that plane. Lauren, the captain, the officers, they had all written their part. And so had she. Angela's phone vibrated lightly against the table. She let it hum for a moment before answering. Monica, I heard what happened. Monica's voice was sharp, efficient. They reached out already. Angela exhaled, leaning back in her chair. Damage control, she said quietly, watching as the man with the tablet flipped a page. Exactly. They want to apologize. Personally. Angela smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Of course, they do. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Angela could picture Monica pinching the bridge of her nose, sifting through emails, balancing two screens at once. Do you want to accept? Monica asked finally. Angela considered this. turning the cup slowly between her fingers. "What exactly are they apologizing for?" she asked. "For how you were treated on the plane." Angela shook her head lightly, though Monica couldn't see it. "No," Angela said, "that's not it. They're apologizing because someone filmed it. Because they're exposed." A beat of silence passed, and Monica didn't argue. Angela leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees. "They aren't sorry for what happened. They're sorry it was seen." Monica's sigh carried through the phone. "So, what now?" Angela's gaze drifted back to the planes lining up outside, each one filled with people who carried their own quiet burdens. "Schedule the meeting," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I'm not accepting apologies." She could hear Monica typing furiously. "Understood. Anything else?" Angela hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly at the man across the lounge. "Yes," she said, "look into the captain. I want to know who he is. And the flight attendant Lauren. I need to know if this was her first time." "You think there's more?" Angela let the question hang, though the answer had already settled in her bones. "There's always more." She ended the call without saying goodbye. The man with the tablet shifted slightly, sensing the conversation had ended. Angela didn't turn toward him, but she felt his presence like a lingering aftertaste. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't mean to interfere." Angela raised an eyebrow, eyes still fixed on the tarmac. "But you did." He nodded, closing the cover of his tablet. "It just didn't seem right." Angela turned to face him fully, crossing one leg over the other, examining him the way she might study a contract. "Not right for whom?" He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. His lips tightened, and he looked away, as if searching for the right answer among the faces drifting past the glass. Angela watched him for a moment longer, then smiled. "Next time," she said softly, "let them feel uncomfortable." The man met her gaze. "Uncertain," Angela continued. "You spoke up because you knew they'd listen to you. But that's the problem, isn't it? They shouldn't need your voice to validate mine." The man nodded slowly, understanding but unable to fully carry the weight of what she had said. Angela didn't expect him to. She rose, smoothing the lines of her jacket, and gathered her bag. "Safe flight," she said, turning away. He watched her as she walked toward the gate, the quiet thunder of her heels echoing through the lounge. Angela stepped into the crowd, her heart steady, her mind sharp. The storm had not passed, but she wasn't waiting for skies to clear. She had learned long ago how to walk through the rain and let it shape her. The conference room was designed to impress floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city skyline. Sleek leather chairs lining a polished table. The kind of room where apologies were polished like silver and handed out with care. Not because they were deserved, but because they were convenient. Angela Hamilton sat at one end of the table, alone but not unarmed. Her silence was sharp, deliberate. She had learned the value of silence long ago. It unsettled men who were used to commanding rooms with their voices. Across from her sat David Archer, regional director for the airline, his suit immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted. Beside him, Evelyn Clark, the head of customer relations, wore a smile so tight it looked like it might crack if Angela so much as exhaled too loudly. Angela watched them, but she did not speak first. This, too, was part of the choreography. They expected her to thank them for their time, to ease the tension in the room, to make them feel at ease for the harm they had caused. She would do no such thing. Finally, David cleared his throat, leaning forward with that same measured confidence Angela had seen in boardrooms for years. "Miss Hamilton, first let me say we deeply regret what happened on your flight." Angela tilted her head slightly, letting the words settle between them. "Do you?" she asked, her voice calm, betraying nothing. David hesitated, caught off guard by the simplicity of her question. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "We do," he continued, recovering quickly. "We take these matters very seriously." Angela's eyes narrowed, her gaze unflinching. "No," she said softly. "You take this seriously because someone recorded it." David opened his mouth to respond, but Angela pressed on. "If that video didn't exist, would I be sitting here?" The room tightened around the question, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. David's polished veneer began to crack, just slightly. "I can assure you, Miss Hamilton, we investigate all complaints thoroughly." Angela's fingers tapped lightly against the table, slow and rhythmic. How many complaints like mine have been filed this year? She asked. Her voice low but unwavering. Evelyn's hand hovered over the folder in front of her. But she hesitated. I don't have that information in front of me, Evelyn said carefully. Angela nodded slowly. That's the problem. The weight of her words filled the room, pushing against the polished windows, pressing down on the shoulders of the two executives who suddenly seemed far smaller than when they had first entered. Angela leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Let me tell you what I know, she said, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. This isn't the first time Lauren Pierce has treated a black passenger differently. And it won't be the last if you keep pretending this is an isolated incident. Evelyn shifted again, flipping through the folder as if hoping to find anything to shield herself from the truth. Angela's voice softened, but it carried the weight of years. I am not the problem, she said. I never was. David exhaled, clasping his hands in front of him. Miss Hamilton, I understand your frustration. We're prepared to offer compensation for the inconvenience you experienced. First-class vouchers for future flights. Hotel accommodations. Angela raised a hand, silencing him. You think I want vouchers? She asked. Leaning back, her eyes, sharp and unwavering, met his. David's words stalled in his throat. Angela let the silence stretch. I'm not here for vouchers, she said finally. I'm here because I can afford to be. But there are people who can't. And they're the ones you ignore. The ones you make smaller with every decision like this. Evelyn's gaze fell to the table, unable to hold Angela's. Angela's voice softened, but it held a quiet ferocity that could not be ignored. I don't need your apology. I need to know what you're going to do when this happens again. David shifted, glancing at Evelyn, who finally spoke. We've started reviewing our employee training programs, Evelyn said quickly. Implicit bias training, customer service improvements. Angela cut her off with a slight raise of her eyebrow. Training doesn't change people who don't believe they need to change. The words hung heavy in the air. Angela folded her hands, letting the quiet return. I'm not interested in platitudes, she said, her voice firm. I want action. I want transparency. And I want to know how many passengers filed complaints like mine but were met with silence. David nodded slowly, understanding now that the meeting would not end with a signature or a handshake. Angela Hamilton did not come here for a settlement. She came to leave the door open for the next person who would not be ignored. Finally, David spoke. We'll get you those numbers, Miss Hamilton, and you have my word this will be handled properly. Angela met his gaze, searching for something genuine beneath the layers of corporate polish. I'll be watching, she said simply. David nodded, his expression unreadable. As Angela stood, Evelyn rose quickly, offering a hand Angela did not take. Instead, Angela adjusted the strap of her bag and walked toward the door. She didn't need their handshakes. She needed their discomfort to linger long after she left the room. Because it was discomfort, not polite apologies, that forced change. The jet sliced through the clouds, the city lights below flickering like embers scattered along the Earth's spine. Angela Hamilton sat by the window, watching the world tilt as the plane began its descent. There was a strange quiet that came with landings, the hum of engines softening. The hush that spread as passengers straightened in their seats, pulled back from whatever worlds they had escaped into during the flight. Angela remained still, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Across the aisle, the man with the tablet sat again, though this time he did not pretend to read. His gaze flickered toward her every so often, like a child glancing at a crack in the ceiling, uncomfortable, but unable to look away for long. Angela let him stare. She had long since made peace with the attention that followed her. It was not admiration or curiosity. It was the weight of expectation. Expectation that she would rise above it all. Expectation that she would be gracious in the face of insult. Expectation that she would make her oppression easy for others to digest. Angela had grown tired of it. The flight attendant, not Lauren but someone younger and unsure of herself, passed by with soft footsteps, offering water as if hydration might rinse the tension from the air. Angela declined with a small shake of her head. She could feel the wheels touching the edge of the tarmac now. The way gravity settled into her chest with every second that brought them closer to the ground. And then, with a heavy breath, the plane landed. The captain's voice, cool and distant, hummed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. We thank you for flying with us. Angela almost smiled at the irony. It was never a question of being thanked. It was a question of being seen. The plane slowed, its weight shifting as it eased toward the gate. The passengers around her stirred to life, pulling bags from overhead compartments, chatting softly about things that mattered only to them. Angela remained seated. She had no interest in joining their urgency. The man with the tablet stood, but before stepping into the aisle, he paused, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. "I hope things work out for you," he said. Angela raised an eyebrow. "They always do," she replied, her voice smooth as glass. He nodded, but there was something else there, something lingering behind the polite well wishes. Guilt, maybe, or relief that his part in the story had been small enough to forget. Angela watched as he disappeared down the aisle. Some people were born to slip away quietly. Others were born to carry the weight of silence wherever they went. By the time Angela stepped off the plane, the terminal was already filled with the restless hum of travelers. A woman in a dark suit waited for her just past the gate. Her expression tight, rehearsed. "Miss Hamilton," the woman greeted, offering a hand Angela didn't take. "I'm with customer relations. We wanted to personally apologize for." Angela's gaze cut through the rest of the sentence. And the woman faltered. "I know who you are," Angela said calmly. "And I know why you're here." The woman swallowed hard. Angela let the silence stretch. There was something satisfying in watching them stumble. Not out of malice, but because it forced them to face the thing they so often chose to avoid. Finally, Angela spoke. "Save your apologies," she said, her voice soft but edged. "I'm not interested in words." The woman hesitated. "What can we offer to make this right?" Angela tilted her head slightly, considering the question as if it were a puzzle laid out before her. "You can stop assuming I need something from you," she replied. The woman blinked, caught off guard. Angela smiled faintly. "Fix it," she said simply. "Not for me. For the people who won't make it to this gate. For the ones you'll never meet." The woman nodded, but Angela could see the doubt etched behind her eyes, the uncertainty that came when someone who was used to holding the power found themselves stripped of it. Angela stepped past her without waiting for a response. By the time she reached the baggage claim, the crowd had thinned, leaving only the faint echo of footsteps against polished floors. Her bag arrived slowly, tumbling onto the carousel like it had been reluctant to make the journey at all. As she lifted it, Angela caught her reflection in the glass wall beyond the belt. She looked as composed as ever, sharp lines, calm eyes, but beneath it all, she felt the familiar hum of exhaustion, the weight of battles fought in places where the rules were unwritten but fiercely upheld. Angela stepped into the night air, where the city spread out before her, loud, indifferent, and full of possibility. The wind tugged gently at her coat, and she pulled it tighter around her shoulders. She had won nothing today, but she had not been defeated. And for now, that was enough.